In April 1912, the Titanic left England on its first voyage. The ship was as long as 3 football fields and as tall as a 12-story building. At that time, it was the biggest and most advanced ship ever built. It was supposed to be unsinkable. But a few days into its voyage, the Titanic hit an iceberg. As the Titanic scraped along the iceberg, its hull ruptured below the waterline. Water began pouring into the front of the ship. As the forward compartments of the ship filled with more and more water, the density of the front of the ship steadily increased. While passengers struggled to get into lifeboats, stresses were building up that would soon break the ship in two and sink it. Second Officer Charles Lightoller was a witness to the beginning of the end.
Just then, the ship took a slight but definite plunge. Those that didn't disappear underwater right away instinctively started to climb toward the stern, which was rising steadily out of the water. I knew only too well the utter futility of struggling towards the stern. There was only one thing to do.
As Lightoller and others struggled for their lives in the icy waters, the Titanic came closer to its end. As the flooding front of the ship became heavier, the back of the ship rose up out of the water. Lightoller describes the astonishing details of what happened next.
The bow of the ship was now rapidly going down, and the stern rising higher and higher out of the water. The terrific strain of bringing the after end of that huge hull out of the water opened the expansion joint near number 1 funnel, causing the funnel to fall, missing me by inches.
Two hours and 40 minutes after the Titanic first struck the iceberg, the unequal distribution of weight in the front and rear of the ship finally broke it in two. The grand ship sank, sending more than 1,500 people and the greatest ship of its time to a watery end. Why did the Titanic sink? As you watch this segment, think about what makes ships float and what caused the Titanic to sink. The Titanic was the pride of Belfast, Northern Ireland, where it was built. It was more than 50 meters tall and about 275 meters long. In its day, the Titanic was the largest moving object ever built. Its engines were 4 stories high, and each of its 3 propellers was larger than a house. Its anchors alone weighed 28,000 kilograms, as much as 20 cars. Yet, despite its incredible weight and the fact that it was constructed of steel, which is far heavier than water, the Titanic floated on the surface of the ocean, just like any other ship. 2 forces are at work on objects in the water: the buoyant force and gravity. Buoyant force is the upward force exerted on an object by the liquid that the object is in. The buoyant force pushes upward, while gravity pulls downward. When an object floats in a fluid, the buoyant force and the force of gravity are equal. As a result of these balanced up and down forces, the object is stationary. It moves neither up nor down. We're most familiar with floating on the surface, but the same principle applies to objects such as submarines and fish that can float below the surface. Although the Titanic had a mass of millions of kilograms, its huge hull, made of 16 separate air-filled compartments, made the Titanic's overall density less than the density of water. But when the Titanic hit the iceberg, this balance was altered. As seawater poured into the front 5 compartments, it displaced the air that had been filling the compartments. Since water is much heavier than air, the density of the front of the ship increased enormously. Soon, the pull of gravity on the increasingly heavy front of the ship overcame its buoyant force, and the front of the ship began to sink. Recent expeditions to the wreckage have shed light on what happened next. These expeditions have allowed structural engineers to make detailed computer simulations of the Titanic's final moments. The stresses within the ship are shown with a spectrum of colors. Red represents the most severe. This first graphic shows the stresses on the Titanic in calm seas.
So I don't see very many stresses in that.
But as the wounded ship fills with water, the stresses in the midsection increase dramatically.
Wow.
Stress.
What is that?
This is the ship just prior to breakup. It's taken on a lot of water in the bow, and that rapid change causes the stresses to increase.
So basically our ship is bending. Forward end of the ship is flooded. The top part of the ship is pulling apart in tension. The bottom or the keel of the ship is compressing, and the steel plates in the keel are actually buckling.
As the bow pulls down, the huge stern rises in the air, the equivalent of a 25-story building suddenly looming above the water.
The stresses that we have in the deck are on the order of 35,000 pounds per square inch. And that's about 50% higher than what the Titanic was actually designed for.
The tremendous weight difference between the front and rear of the ship produced stresses that finally overcame the ship's steel structure. The computer model helped support eyewitness testimony that the Titanic broke in two.
I heard explosions, a sort of rumbling sound. I imagined the decks had blown up with the pressure pulling the boat down. Major Arthur Pusher.
You could see a propeller right clear. And you could see underneath the keel. You could see part of the keel. Joseph Scarrett.
And her lights went dim as she broke clean in two. Steward, Frederick Crowe.
One of the greatest ships ever built was destroyed in a matter of hours, broken in two by the incredible physical forces that had built up inside it. Today, the remains of the Titanic rest on the ocean floor. But by understanding what caused the ship to sink, we can learn new ways to build better and safer ships.
Which forces have to be in balance in order for an object to float?